Welcome to our participants today, and I'm looking forward to this robust discussion about cybersecurity. And welcome to our panelists, Nick Ward from DOJ, Ken Bible from DHS, and Brian Tersch from Microsoft. And I'd like to start out by saying two recent cyber incidents have illustrated that we continue to have gaps in our security posture within the federal government and also in commercial enterprise and critical infrastructure. And SolarWinds showed us the vulnerabilities that can be present in the software development lifecycle process and our supply chain. And the Colonial Pipeline event highlighted the dire economic impact and disruption of our daily lives that could actually result from an attack on critical infrastructure. Has this activity changed the conversation that you see in your agencies or with your clients, and how so? So Nick, if we could start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me today. I really appreciate it. The SolarWinds attack and this significant data breach that we're all dealing with in the federal government and within industry has changed the way we're doing some stuff and the way we're looking at cybersecurity in the future. And one big aspect that it's really having a pretty significant impact in a good way is that it's really driving some cultural change. So a lot of the mission owners that do day-to-day operations and don't often think about, the need to be able to encrypt an individual email or think about how they're sending sensitive data to another agency. Now this has happened to them and it's impacted them. And so it is from a very personal level. We have individual lawyers that are asking the questions, how can I do better at protecting the data that I'm sending to my partners, whether it be in law enforcement or over at DHS or over at U.S. courts? And so it has helped us in that regard, and that there's a lot more interest from the very lowest levels of the organization on how we can change the culture and do a better job at protecting our data. And then at a more strategic level, there's a lot of visibility and awareness on we need to do better in the way we design our systems and the way we design our infrastructure. And it's not an immediate, mission first, although everything is about the mission, but there's a lot more awareness that cybersecurity absolutely can impact the mission, and that we need to prioritize making sure that we take the right steps to protect the mission when we're building systems or designing infrastructure. So it's actually been a net positive in that regard. I mean, the whole experience is negative for everybody, and we would never want this to happen. But looking at the silver lining, it has helped in terms of changing the way we think about cybersecurity culturally.
So you've seen a heightened awareness from your business leaders and your program leaders. And also you've seen some movement and a sense of urgency toward how do we fix this in your particular organization. So Ken, have you seen similar things?
Yeah, I think that there is a lot that is about the SolarWinds incident that is a shift in the visibility of cybersecurity and the impact beyond maybe the initial foothold. So for example, in my mind, the real interesting aspect of SolarWinds was that the real, not discounting the immediate impact of an intrusion on a network monitoring system, but it was when they were able to move laterally into things like our Office 365 and things like that. And to Nicholas's point, it becomes about how do you understand the encryption of your data? How do you understand how your data is protected? So I think there was a lot there. For me, as I tried to go lift a relatively nascent supply chain risk management program, it really punctuated a couple of things. One was that we don't really have any true certification of the composition, integrity, and provenance of commercial off-the-shelf software that we buy. SolarWinds was a commercial off-the-shelf product that was used by thousands of companies and government organizations. And so it triggered a lot of the discussion about how do we get at that kind of certification, which is where some of the software bill of materials discussion in the new cyber EO comes out. And so that's something we really got to know through. What it did was focus on the fact that we needed to take another look at supply chain risk management for more than just hardware. We actually needed to look at the software components as well and think about it through the whole life cycle of the products and services that we buy and use.
So building security in and using methodologies like DevSecops to make sure that things are done in a fashion that actually enables that kind of security to be built into the product.
Yeah, maybe. I think the challenge with SecDevOps or DevSecOps is, do we go far enough with it? In other words, I've talked a lot about the fact that the real magic of SecDevOps is not about a material solution. It's a culture, bringing the operator and the functional community together. And as you know, they build from a context of security. And particularly as we move into cloud for modernization, how do we understand the inheritance of the security controls down through that stack, from infrastructure as a service all the way up through the developed code on top of that stack? And that's where we'll start to build the security in. Otherwise, we may just build really good software living on really bad infrastructure.
Right, it's the combo platter of the two. So Brian, being both a service provider, a cloud service provider, and a software developer, how are you seeing this play out in your world?
Yeah, thanks. It's definitely interesting to see, because we're starting to see the evolution of attacks from different angles than we had before, right? If you go with the old kind of castle model of inside my walls, I'm safe, right? And this gets you into the zero trust conversation going forward. To moving to modern attacks, if you move into cloud, your exposure is differently than on premise. And to kind of go back to your early question about how do you see things changing, it's really the evolution of a thought process. What I say is cyber has changed since we started talking. Have you changed with it, right? Because historically, we've been very slow to adopt new changes within the cyber world. So when you start looking at, it's no longer maybe this operating system I'm protecting, it's an API endpoint. So I have to look at what mitigations and controls are in there. There's definitely lessons learned from us as the vendor side of it, of how we do secure software development, right? What can we do to do more code integrity verification, things like maybe using blockchain or whatever to sign binaries a little bit differently in the process to a manifest or something to say, hey, this way we can do proof of chain of custody of code and to see what's written within the system. We as an organization, obviously, we were affected by this as well, right? And we had some lessons learned internally as well towards our customers. And sometimes we over rely on particular controls within agencies and organizations. And we're looking at how do you pull that forward? How do you modernize? Or you have maybe a policy that was developed a decade ago that maybe is not correlating to how it would function in the cloud or how you do a mitigation in the world. And it's that kind of tug and war back between policies from a while back to current implementations within architecture. So it's definitely interesting on all gambits of how we code and change that world to how we pull up agencies as well with us to accept kind of modern methodologies and ways of thinking. So
exactly. And you start to see this coming together of it's a continuous environment, because whatever you do to support the particular agencies that you contract with, it really is hybrid in the sense that they have their environment and then it extends into yours. And to be able to both understand what that architecture is and to be able to respond to incidents and to build that security into the equation, it really is a continuous level playing field all the way from on-prem to the cloud and back. That's so right. It's difficult to pull all those things together, but the cyber EO that was issued a couple weeks ago doubles down and creates on that sense of urgency for us to literally up our game in terms of cyber posture. So let's address a few of the key tenets of the EO and discuss how you see some of these elements playing out in your own environment and across the federal government. And the first thing I'd like to address is this notion of threat sharing between commercial sector and also the federal government, and CISA as the center of gravity for that. So Ken, I'd like to start with you because your agency owns that center of gravity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they have certainly a very broad mission, and that's that was what one of the core things that CISO was created around, was this information sharing across government and even with industry. And I do think that putting some teeth in that, providing some additional drivers to that information sharing with industry is going to be a powerful tool. How we implement that, how we respect the fact that corporate America has some other dynamics, and even internationally, other countries and their restrictions on how data can be shared play into our ability to make that an effective tool. But it is something that there are key means to go get at the information needed to properly categorize what's happening in a particular incident, and to get that information across governments so that we're not grasping at straws as to what to do in response. And I think so that aspect of it is fairly significant. How we go about getting that and enforcing that with the commercial, with the outside of government, that's probably got a little bit more work to be done, but certainly very much supportive of that, developing up that mindset. Microsoft's done some things, and Brian's here. We've had a really good dialogue and how do we share more information with Microsoft through their various government programs within the licensure that we have and use of Microsoft. I don't know how that will play out in terms of other companies and other organizations, but regardless of what license you own or what you're paying for, when we're in this kind of a fight where it knows no boundaries, then you really have to be able to get to the right information at the right time, regardless of what the contract says.
And this notion of constant situational awareness, of being in real time and understanding the environment in its entirety. Nick, do you see that playing out at DOJ also?
Yeah, absolutely, and from a number of different aspects. But one area is, as we started all responding to SolarWinds, different agencies started seeing little breadcrumbs before other agencies, and that some agencies collaborated more with CISO than other agencies, and then our vendors have a big part in that. Like we had SolarWinds for us started way back in June, and we actually engaged with some of our vendors to at least two of our vendors, in fact, on that incident, and they had both experienced or worked with other customers dating far back. And the problem I think that we saw was that we work these incidents in silos in large degree, and when we share IOCs, it's often an IOC. And what we learned with SolarWinds is that the IOCs themselves weren't necessarily overly valuable. You needed the context of what was happening. You likely needed the people actually working the incident, talking with other people working incidents that kind of sort of look and feel and smell a little bit similar. And those are the areas that information sharing are going to really have to address. And I know from our perspective, we're looking at when we are going to look at new contract language and things like that with our vendors, is not only authorize them to share directly with CISA and the FBI, but also requiring some amount of sharing in relation to us. I know it's going to take some time to figure out the right way to balance that contract language, but we want to ensure that there's going to be these big picture views on what's happening and what's targeting the federal government at large, and not just me, because the better awareness that we have on these broad attacks against many agencies or many customers for that matter, the better it is for us, because we'll have better awareness and being able to respond to those incidents when they do occur.
No, exactly. And you bring up such an important point, and that's the sharing of information sort of being the canary in the coal mine, if you will, which agencies actually see these kinds of events first and how they promulgate that information to the entirety of the federal government. So Brian, did you, given this kind of an incident and the way that we all have to play better in the sandbox to be able to respond to it, what changes have you made at Microsoft in that arena?
Yeah, good question. So starting off, there's a program that we have called the Government Security Program that Kent had kind of mentioned, right? Or GSP that CISA and other folks are involved in. And that's how we share all of our threat intelligence based on nation state events, what we're seeing, interesting things, this kind of bi-directional feed between government agencies that are members, someone like CISA, as well as how we get back. And to Nick's point, you're right, there's some things that we're legally bound to by contracts today that I can't go, hey, these 5 people have a problem, central organization, because it's in the contract saying I can't share that information, right? So we're working within the government space and with industry to see how to have better communication. If you go back to the beginning of SolarWinds, right, FireEye had some stuff, they brought us in together, but we can only see what we see as well, right? If you were on our cloud and we saw activity related to it, we could then inform someone. If you weren't on our platform, we had no visibility into on-premise or other places, right? So depending on where you are is the visibility we can do, and then we'd reach out and contact that agency in at least a one-on-one. But definitely to Nick's point early on, there was definitely a gap in what was occurring with this until it became a little bit known. And then once it was known, we definitely declare what we call a nation state event, right? And then we could reach the appropriate people within the federal space to kind of say, hey, there's a big issue going on that you need to be aware of. And then started working through each agency to give them direct communication. So we're a part of all the regular councils. I know our leadership is going and working within the White House and different places to say, hey, we were one of the most open about this. I don't know that anybody else, maybe SolarWinds himself, but every single event related to this attack, we basically were public about when it involved us and how it affected things. So we were very open to providing more information out holistically, right?
So we really have to also double down on improving our investigative capability and root cause analysis, applying our lessons learned. And it seems, at least in my experience, when I was at OMB and DHS, there was a somewhat disjointed approach to incident response. It was not necessarily uniform across all federal agencies. Sometimes there was some confusion about when you would actually declare an incident and then what the protocol was from that point. What do you see occurring in the environment right now that would help you mitigate that problem?
I think it goes to that ability to identify that you actually do have an incident and the scope of it. So to Nicholas's point about being able to see what the breadcrumbs are and then kind of look at your situation and say, are you seeing similar things? And understanding that faster. And then being able to go understand what is at risk so that you can look at it through that lens of does it rise to the level of an incident that needs to be declared. Hopefully you get in front of it where you're not having to go get to that state of exfiltration of data. But I think that's where I would go with it. Is this is about how do we start to understand what's happening broadly across government so that organizations can put the breadcrumbs together to get at the whole picture. And CISA and its role as kind of the, looking at this across the board, being able to give us the greater warning. But another aspect of this is really understanding the threat side. So it's really being able to understand where the threat's coming from. I would have loved to have known from some sort of reporting that there was a concerted effort against supply chain software development, supply chain efforts, or around these. It sounds intuitive that they'd be going after these highly privileged things that had tremendous access into the networks or into the environments. But those have traditionally been really hard to get after. It was easier to take the easy path to phish and get a password and go in the front door. This was really exotic, and it would be great to be able to improve the understanding of that threat environment as well from various sources. And I know that's a little bit harder to get at, but it's about kind of what's the intelligence support to cyber that helps us understand the threat better and earlier.
Yeah, well, let's explore that a little bit. Are there capabilities, tools, processes, procedures that start to look at anomalous activity now that allows you to identify these things earlier? So
I think, I'll let Brian talk a little bit about specifically, maybe there's something there in Microsoft. I'll look at it from my fighting hole. I'm looking at it more through that lens of, hey, what's happening in the supply chain that would trigger me to want to look closer? Was there a corporate ownership change? Was there a decision by a company to offshore its development? Was there a significant change in the investment of that corporation in cybersecurity? What is the open source telling me about that? So I'm looking at it more from the supply side of the equation than I am necessarily from that intelligence kind of perspective. I do think there's probably some mechanisms that are evolving that will help us a little bit in terms of the threat. But right now we're in many cases having to go kind of infer that threat through other means.
So it's context that's very important to you, the entirety of business operation.
Yeah, from me, when I think about it as a supply chain risk management problem, I'm looking at the context. I'm looking at the opportunity and the likelihood of something happening, and then the consequences of that happening. So Brian threw out the zero trust term, and zero trust could have done probably some interesting things to this particular threat of SolarWinds, as could rigorously enforced multi-factor authentication. But so there may be easy ways rather than the exquisite ways. But you'd like to kind of understand what's the threat actor trying to get after, and then we can assess what your defensive posture needs to be. Nicholas,
so you've introduced the topic of zero trust architecture and multi-factor authentication and encryption. Nick, do you? What is it to you? What is the definition of that to you? And how are, because it means many things to many people, how are you actually exploring the implementation of those kinds of capabilities at DOJ?
For me, and how we're looking at zero trust is really looking at it. It can be a loaded term, right? And every vendor, of course, will have their own definition to help drive their products, and they're probably not wrong from the standpoint that zero trust, when it was conceived, it was really intended to be this idea of changing culture towards doing a lot of things we've already all been talking about for probably at least 5 years, but probably more like a decade or even more. That's things like segmenting applications. That's like doing good. You need to be very good at identity management. You need to use strong credentials and get rid of passwords. These are all things that we should have been doing all along, but they're also quite difficult in a lot of ways. So the way we're looking at it, for one, zero trust, that terminology and the marketing that's gone behind it has done a lot in terms of being able to help get interest at that business leadership layer and being able to, they want to know, what is this stuff? We keep hearing about it. The executive order mentions it. So it helps us from the point of view is now it gives us a way to talk to leadership and be able to relate what they're hearing about in the news every day. But from a technical perspective, it really is taking, so that whole idea that security is implemented as an infrastructure layer on the network is gone from our perspective. It's going to be taking it and moving it up one layer in an abstraction layer and making the entire security plane happens one level above at a more identity-based plane. And it allows us to do things like, and an analogy we like to talk about is each individual person has their own universe. In zero trust, each individual has a universe that they operate in, and everybody's universe is completely different. I create a policy that says Nick Ward is allowed to access these 5 applications as a user, and these other 4 applications as an administrator, and you can't even see the other applications at all in any way, shape, or form. You can't ping them, nothing. And then on the same virtual net or VLAN, I can have Brian Church sitting there, and he has a different set of 3 applications that he's a user on, and another 10 that he's an admin on. And we can't see the same applications unless that policy really dictates it. So it really creates this way, a different way to look at it. I don't have network engineers looking at firewall rules like we've always had to do. Instead, they're talking about, let's give people access to the applications and the data. And there's some magical things that happen as a result. One of those is being that instead of trying to teach a user how to access applications when they're at work, and teaching them a different way when they're at home, and saying use this credential when you're at Starbucks and use this other credential when you're trying to badge in and access it through a secure terminal at work, it becomes more uniform for the user, which improves security overall because they don't have to learn when to do what, and we don't have to keep lowering and raising security bars. It's very uniform wherever they go. But we've also achieved that micro segmentation of applications, and and if something happens to Brian and he goes rogue or he gets compromised, I can disable his access much more easily because we have this more centralized way to manage that policy.
So you're creating.
So that's kind of what it is. That's pretty high level, but
yeah.
I would take it even higher level than that. It was a great explanation, but again, the key point is that we're moving away from telework and the fact that we've all been teleworking or out of the office for over a year, and people are using their home networks and using VPNs to connect back in behind a firewall to get to the privileges they have to just about everything behind that crunchy firewall boundary, that infrastructure layer that Nick talked about. And the reality is that's really punching holes in that security that you put in place with those exquisite and expensive firewalls. And so there's really a shift away from trying to go protect at a boundary, at a perimeter, to being able to defend based on who you are. As Nick points out, it's based on the individual's machine all the way up to the individual themselves. And you only get access to the things that you have privileges to. And I'm not depending upon the network necessarily to know that. I have policy enforcement points that can tell, should I have access to this particular resource, this particular data? So it's a fundamental architectural shift. The issue is that it's kind of gotten dragged off into the realm where everyone has their one shot, buy my product and you'll have zero trust. And that's not how it works. That's right. Not how the architecture was even conceived of. And part of the challenge, I think, is there, as Nick points out too, there's tons of ways to implement it. And even the NIST guidance on zero trust, you can interpret it in a couple different ways that would leave you pretty much like you are today, as opposed to really taking a dramatic look at what the opportunities are based on the fact that telework's likely, even with things starting to return a little bit to normal, telework is still going to be a very real thing for many, many workers for the near, if not far future. And I would argue that our experience with telework has also predicated some conversations or triggered some conversation even about remote work. Do we have to be in an office environment? And so all those things drive you towards this kind of zero trust model for how you spend the data and resources of an organization.
Moving from the outside in to inside out, and looking at it as opposed to castle and moat, we're actually creating personas, even whether it's for a device or for an individual, and all of those are tied to fine-grained permissioning with least permission access, so that you have fewer admins in the system also. So it seems to open up the universe for some very interesting ways of working.
As Nicholas points out, the rub here is really the lingua franca of this is about identity. How do we get our arms around identity? And that's really the holy grail of all this.
Authentication. Yeah.
And if we learn anything at all from the SolarWinds incident, is that we cannot trust all the software on our network. We're never going to be able to do supply chain risk management well enough that you can implicitly trust everything running on your network. So, I really, should I trust my VLANs any more than someone's home VLANs? And hopefully the answer is, I guess it would be nice if you could say yes, but in reality, we've got to architect that the answer is no.
Yep. Yeah. If you look at the evolution, right? If you look at, Ken mentioned 800-207, right, from NIST and the way things are going, but you never think a Microsoft guy would mention a Google thing here. But if you look at back to like the Google Beyond Corp paper, right, or even what we've done internally as an organization, this is the thing that people used to be scared of. You move all your applications to that edge, right? And to Ken's point is, do I need a VPN backhaul? It's about the CIA, right? Confidentiality, integrity, availability, right? But when you move into a ZT, it's about a policy enforcement. So it's microsegmentation and policy-based enforcement, which traditionally, let's pick on our stuff, Active Directory, you log on and that was it. You got access and you always had that access. But in a modern zero trust world, the access is constantly evaluated, right? Continuous evaluation based on my risk, my behavior to the point of my device, right? So now if I can move all my devices to the edge or my access, so when Microsoft, I rarely ever, we have some old systems still, but I don't VPN to anything anymore to hack my corporate resources, to access everything. One, as they move to the cloud, how do you VPN into the cloud per se, right? I can't really do that because my resources are external. Now you technically can do certain things, but by creating this kind of central policy enforcement point with identity as that key point, I now can say, well, Brian is from where, or Brian's risk is based on this, and his device is based on this. But I can then continuously check that statistic and say, well, it's changed because his risk level changes. Now enforce another factor of authentication, turn them only read-only access, right? So those are things we couldn't really do well in the past. That technology has kind of caught up to the principles from the Jericho forums and things that have been talked about for a while, and that now I can pivot post in near real time, right? Nothing's really physics in real time, right? In near real time, I can make pivotal decisions and stop, block, and make changes based on that access that's happening because of the policies that are occurring that didn't happen years ago. So it's definitely a move, because when you say, hey, stick my website on the internet, I'm like, oh my gosh, right? That's terrible. Don't do that. Obviously, there's gates and firewalls and WAFs and security in front of it. But by adding that central authentication point, that central control point, you can even take legacy applications that have no concept of what zero trust would be, and you front them in behind something that does. And now I've just added a lot of security posture to legacy applications that I would not have before, right?
Yeah. Or you would have to gone back and recode and redo some of those legacy applications,
Right.
when you can actually do it in this manner and it's much more efficient.
And, and Graves, that's really the key to the whole modernization piece, right? Do you come out better taking the legacy application and putting the velvet rope around it in the cloud, and putting that extra infrastructure piece in front of it, which is added cost too? Or is it cheaper to actually bite the bullet and actually modernize for the future, and modernize in cloud native ways that inherit all that security natively?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
It's leapfrogging, like people don't have to go back and recode old systems. They can actually leap into the future with these kinds of technologies that are available to us today.
Yeah, I mean, I think the end game is exactly what Ken was saying, right? People would want to get to there. That gives you a middle step to allow you to add those hooks into something that may not, because we know the cost of implementation and change, and that's always the tug, right? Is the finance and the evolution of it is, can I now add some security today and then modernize in the way forward and kind of do it in an incremental step? I mean, if we all could blow it up and kind of start all over again, of course, we'd start to the furthest to the right, and do kind of more native implementations with native security. But we know the challenges there in transformation with, look at the colonial pipeline, right? I mean, obviously what happened in that, and the OT world especially, you have many sensors that are 20 years old sensors out there that were never designed for modern threats and attacks, or legacy applications that a contract was written 20 years ago and it's running NT 4.0 that we don't even support as a vendor anymore, right? How do we get those critical systems off of the very legacy applications, right, and legacy products? And because there's some dependencies there that people are afraid to, there's always that one manufacturing machine in the corner that you just pray you don't touch and never breaks, because the vendor doesn't even exist anymore, that you run your whole critical infrastructure off. And it's fun with mission assurance conversations when you're talking about that, but it's the reality that we're in. And at least there's different incremental ways to improve your security posture, right?
Yeah. COBOL code and mainframes, we all have them. So you mentioned, Brian, and this is a topic I also wanted to explore. It's not that these issues haven't been known for some time, and our actual response to implementations have somewhat lagged.
Yeah.
What are some of the barriers that have slowed your progress, and how do you see those being addressed? Is it policy? Is it funds? Is it procurement, contracts, whatever comes to mind?
Policy for sure, right? I mean, we know it takes years for policy. I think its average is what, about 18 months for a policy to kind of be implemented in general is the average time that you have. And I'd say it's kind of naturally for in cybersecurity, we always say changing is risk. I kind of say the opposite, that not changing is risk. But it's kind of bringing that mental shift, as I was saying earlier, to pull people up of, well, I've always done it this way, and now you're telling me to do it this way. Well, that's a risk to me because I'm uncomfortable with that change. But yet the attack surface is changing every day, every minute. Things that pop up, like Nick mentioned, like IOCs, let's pick up something like an IP address. Most of them are up and down within 48 hours, right? So by the time you put a block in a system, that's irrelevant anymore because the attack's already moved on to the next thing, right? So we have to get in this mentality of even security, what do you call it, DevSecops, or the agility within an organization to be kind of really leaning forward a little bit. And, you don't have to be on the bleeding edge to be on the leading edge at the same time. But you mentioned, like, if you look at the EDR stuff, that's in the EO, right? EDR, we've had an EDR solution for over 5 years and people have been running it for a long time. It's not new in the practice, right? So we're just getting to that state that you're pulling up, either people are comfortable with that as a technology, as a mainstream, or that it's that kind of tug of war of, well, I liked what I had because I feel safe and I don't want to change, or someone made a decision 3 years ago on something, so I'm comfortable with it, understanding that changing your decision doesn't mean it was wrong. It's just the evolution of a decision, the evolution of the cycle that happens, and technology has to adopt quickly these days, right? And that's where kind of cloud starts to happen in general. For those that love or hate it, our cloud seems to change every 5 minutes. People on the call can agree with me there. And so it's hard to keep up with that too, but that's how it works in modern threats, right? If you look at whether it's SolarWinds or polymorphic code or something like that, or metamorphic code, right? These are things that don't have signatures or traditional things that happen because they're always changing. Like SolarWinds, every execution hit a different endpoint URL and things happen that constantly changed on it. And if you're doing traditional security models, you would just miss it, right? So you have to have a system that can then do analytics, can do sandboxing, can do different things, behavioral, right, kind of aspects to it to say this just looks bad. And that's where EDR really starts coming in and looking at more endpoints. But traditional EDR doesn't work on necessarily a OT device or a television, right? They work a little bit differently. So it's understanding what protections can you put in place into what the devices that are on your network and how that works for you, right? So I think it's definitely, if we get the policy, will help push the laggers, because there's some that went from really behind to in front of everybody. You could say late, made them move faster. And then there's the ones that kind of just move at that chuggy pace, right? And either policy can push them forward, or the education process will help them say, hey, I get it now. Okay, the zero trust thing is now like the standard term. It's like saying synergy of this day, right? Zero trust has become understood, but 3 years ago, people like, oh, that's crazy, right? That's not an idea, right? And now that's all everybody talks about. So it's just getting the education, the industry, and the policy behind it to kind of drive a little bit faster, I think.
Yeah, I think we were talking about it as internet as transport and working at the data layer. We were calling it different things, but it's still been in the vernacular for some time. Nick, I know earlier we had talked about talent acquisition, the human factor in this whole equation, and how you're developing your cyber talent and hiring into that equation, and most importantly, how you're changing the utilization of that talent within your organization.
Yeah, so I mean, Brian, I don't disagree that policy is a major challenge that needs to be overcome, being able to do it quicker. But part of that and part of these new models is we need people to do all of this stuff. I think both DevSecops and Zero Trust actually changes how we do both IT operations and security operations pretty dramatically. So much so that we're looking at, the security operations center is not typically driving major architectural changes for an entire enterprise. Well, today they are. With DevSecOps doing security as code, is that all needs to be baked into these applications directly. It needs to be part of what we do on a day-to-day basis. And the days of having siloed teams is kind of got, I mean, I know we've talked about NOSCs for forever, right? But like these teams have to be coming closer and closer together. And is security driving IT operations and vice versa? It's got to happen. But the big challenge in all of that is who has the skill sets to do this? How do you create these matrix teams that can do all these different things? And I know it's challenging. The smaller the organization, the tougher it's going to be too, because you can't. An organization like mine or most federal agencies actually can't create the talent pipeline that a Microsoft or an Amazon can do, because we only have, we might only be one or two deep in a lot of areas. And so how do we go out and recruit and set up partnerships with the companies that can create these pipelines to help shuffle folks and be fully aware that we're bringing people in, they're probably not sticking around forever, but how do we create these pipelines of talent I know we have to look at that. How do we compete? And even agencies have different hiring authorities and pay incentives and the competition across federal government. There certainly needs to be a concerted effort on standardizing some of that and creating these pipelines to move talent through organizations. And so we can really create a workforce for all of us. We all need it. I think we're probably hundreds of thousands of people short on cybersecurity across the industry, and we all need to be working together on creating the right kinds of pipelines to build that talent.
In the final analysis, we've talked a lot of areas of interest today, but there's much to do here, and the list is absolutely daunting. So what keeps you up at night? And final word, what's your priority in terms of what you want to fix first? Ken, can we start with you?
Sure. So I always say that you've got great people working for the department. So very little keeps me up at night per se. I would say that technically I do see the challenge with kind of the bifurcation that's existed between operational technology and information technology, and the fact that those barriers are really going away every time someone plugs something new into the system, a Raspberry Pi to control an old PLC, right? Mm-hmm. So really thinking about that and figuring out how do we architecturally take that on board and maybe adopt some of these contexts of the zero trust, even in that arena, right? So we don't necessarily have to rip out every programmable logic controller out there out of the system, the 18,000 different brands of industrial controls. But there ought to be some way that we can put something in front that we can kind of create that barrier that allows us to have some assurance that nothing is going to happen that was not designed to happen on that PLC or on that Windows NT box that's in it, right? So I think that's the thing that sticks out to me. I do believe that we're at an incredible opportunity, particularly with the visibility that this administration has provided to the imperatives around cyber and cybersecurity. So we have an opportunity, and we have to coalesce around what we want to do. We talked a little bit about the workforce, and I agree with Nicholas that figuring out the pipelines and figuring out what the incentives are and getting the right hiring strategy to recognize the fact that we're probably not going to hire people who are going to stay in the same seat for 30 years. We're going to be very lucky if we have them for 3 years. So let's recognize that and build our hiring strategy to accommodate it, rather than trying to find the one rarefied person that's going to stay with the organization for a whole career. That's just not the way people are coming up. Young people are coming up. And leveraging the diversity that we have across the nation. And even to that point I made earlier about the remote work, do we have to go move everybody into the particular geographic location to have them effectively work in this field? And I think we're beginning to go see the fact that maybe we don't. And that opens up a tremendous resource or talent pool that perhaps we haven't heretofore plumbed for those jewels, those folks that can really help us out.
Exactly. Nick, final words from you?
Yeah, I mean, if there's one thing that keeps me up is that we're making decisions and trying to do things very quickly. And number one, do we have the right people to do everything that we need to do? There's so much and so much pressure to do things very quickly. The thing that probably keeps me up is I want to make sure that we're being thoughtful in the decisions that we're making, and we're not making hasty decisions in response to some of this activity. So thoughtful responses is probably my one big thing. And in terms of, I mean, we are really going to embrace the zero trust idea. We wanted to do it beforehand. Now we have even stronger incentives to achieve it. And with a focus on understanding our most high value data and high value assets and getting those things protected first. And so it's certainly a measured and strategic direction on adopting and isolating high value data and making that very available to our mission owners.
That's a delicate balance, absolutely. And Brian, from the commercial sector side?
I was going to say Nick and Ken would keep me up at night normally.
Supporting their mission, yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I definitely get those phone calls. I mean, we're always one day away from the next, right? I mean, obviously during the holiday period and some things, I was like, man, I just need 2 weeks of something bad not happening, right? So I think it's things are more in our face today, right? And it's making sure we have the right mitigations and the right processes as an organization to look at those modern threats and to make sure we're definitely secure in our platform, because now people are relying on us, right, for their missions, and to make sure we have the right security, the right stability, and the right visibility for everybody. And to be fair, we learn as well as each organization does, right, on what we need to change and improve on. So that continuous improvement. So what keeps me up is that unknown, right? That one day will show up, and if we're properly prepared and have the right gates and the right controls in place to then kind of stop that when it becomes a known, right? So
yeah. Well, they don't call it the advanced persistent threat for nothing. It's always out there and it's always evolving. So I thank you, our panelists today, for a very interesting and informative discussion on the cyber issue. And with that, we'll turn it back over to our program.